Sometimes a man reaches the end of his road with nothing but his pride and a faithful companion. For Jedediah Cole, that companion was an old dog named Whiskey, and together they faced the harsh Oregon winter with just $1 silver between them and starvation. When Jed spotted a rotted wagon for sale outside a forgotten trading post, he bought it hoping for shelter. As they pulled away the moss and decay, they found a hidden compartment with a faded journal and a lockbox containing a deed to an abandoned gold claim from 1867. The journal told of a settler family who vanished while running from a debt collector. What started as a search for shelter became a quest for justice and redemption. But would this discovery save Jed or destroy him? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the towering Douglas firs like memories that refused to fade, and Jedediah Cole understood that feeling well. At 73, he had more yesterdays than tomorrows, and each dawn in these Oregon mountains reminded him of both the beauty and burden of a life fully lived. His weathered hands, scarred from decades of working timber and trapping game, now trembled slightly as he poured the last of his coffee grounds into the dented tin pot. Beside him, Whiskey stretched his graying muzzle and yawned. The old hound's movements as deliberate and careful as his master's. Whiskey wasn't just a dog, he was Jed's compass, his conscience, and his closest friend rolled into one loyal package. The blue tick-hound had been with him for 12 years now, ever since that autumn day when Jed found him as a pup, half-starved and abandoned near Devil's Creek. The worn leather collar around Whiskey's neck told their story in every scratch. And stain, countless hunts through dense undergrowth, river crossings during spring floods, and quiet evenings by campfires when conversation wasn't necessary because understanding ran deeper than words. The collar had been supple and bright when Jed first buckled it around the young dog's neck, but time and weather had aged it into something that matched them both, tough, reliable, and marked by experience. Now it bore the patina of shared hardships, its surface darkened by rain and snow, campfire smoke and mountain dust. Like Jed himself, it had seen better days but continued to serve its purpose with quiet dignity. Their current camp sat in a natural clearing where an old rock slide had opened the forest canopy years ago. Jed had chosen this spot not for its beauty, though the view of the Cascade Peaks was magnificent, but for its practical advantages. Fresh water ran nearby, the wind patterns kept the mosquitoes manageable, and the rocky overhang provided shelter from the worst weather. Most importantly, it was far enough from the main trails that curious folks left them alone. Jed had always been a solitary man by nature, but these last few years had deepened that tendency into something approaching hermitage. After Sarah died, his wife of 42 years, the cabin they'd shared down in Cedar Falls had become too full of memories and too empty of purpose. He'd sold it for barely enough to keep body and soul together, bought basic camping gear, and headed into the high country with Whiskey. That was 3 years ago, and despite the hardships, he'd never regretted the decision. The mountains had always been his sanctuary. As a young man, he'd worked the lumber camps, learning the forest's moods and secrets. Later, he'd guided hunting parties and taught outdoor skills to city folks who wanted to taste wilderness without truly understanding its demands. But those days of steady income were long past, and now he survived on odd jobs in the small settlements, scattered throughout these hills, splitting firewood, repairing fences, sometimes helping with harvest when his back allowed it. The nearest settlement was Millerville, a collection of weathered buildings clustered around a sawmill that had seen better decades. The town's population fluctuated between 40 and 60 souls, depending on the season and the mill's fortunes. Most residents had known Jed for years, and they treated him with the respectful distance that mountain folk accorded to those who chose solitude. They understood that a man's reasons for seeking the wilderness were his own business, and they respected his choice, even when they couldn't fully comprehend it. Martha Henderson ran the general store and served as the unofficial mayor, postmaster, and gossip central of Millerville. She was a widow herself, 10 years younger than Jed, but old enough to understand loss. Her store carried the essentials: canned goods, basic tools, ammunition, and the kind of sturdy clothing that mountain life demanded. More importantly, she maintained an informal credit system for folks like Jed, who were long on character but short on cash. "You're looking thin, Jedediah," she'd told him just last week when he'd traded 3 dressed rabbits for coffee and flour. "Winter's coming hard this year. I can feel it in my bones." Martha's bones were usually right about weather, and Jed knew she was probably right about his appearance too. The mirror had become his enemy these past months, showing him a face that belonged to his grandfather's generation: hollow cheeks, deep-set eyes, and skin that looked like old leather left too long in the sun. But pride was sometimes all a man had left, and Jed wore his with the same stubborn dignity that had carried him through 7 decades of life's challenges. Tom Miller owned the sawmill, though "owned" was perhaps too strong a word. The bank in the county seat held the real title, and Tom fought each month to keep the operation running. He was a good man in his 50s, with calloused hands and an understanding heart. When Jed needed work, Tom usually found something: stacking lumber, maintaining equipment, or using his knowledge of the local timber to scout new cutting areas. The pay was modest, but Tom always threw in extra: a bag of sawdust for banking fires, scraps of good wood for carving, or sometimes just a hot meal shared in comfortable silence. Then there was Father Miguel, the circuit priest who served 3 small settlements on a rotating basis. He was a young man, probably not yet 40, with the kind of energy and optimism that reminded Jed of his own distant youth. Miguel had tried several times to draw Jed into conversations about faith and purpose, but he'd learned to respect the old mountain man's reticence. Instead, their relationship had settled into a pattern of quiet mutual respect, Miguel offering spiritual comfort when it was needed, Jed offering practical wisdom about surviving in country that could kill the unprepared. These were good people, Jed reflected, the kind who'd formed the backbone of communities for generations. They understood hardship, respected honest work, and looked after their own in the unspoken ways that mattered most. But even among friends, Jed felt the weight of his reduced circumstances. Every favor accepted, every meal shared, every small kindness extended reminded him of how far he'd fallen from the self-sufficient man he'd once been. The transition hadn't been sudden. After Sarah's death, bills had accumulated: medical expenses that insurance didn't cover, funeral costs that dignity demanded, and the gradual erosion of savings that came with age and infirmity. He'd sold the cabin not from wanderlust but from necessity, and the camping life wasn't the romantic adventure some might imagine. It was cold, uncomfortable, and sometimes dangerous for a man his age. Yet Jed found something valuable in the simplicity. Each day brought basic challenges: finding food, staying warm, keeping dry, that didn't allow time for the kind of deep grief that had threatened to consume him in that empty cabin. Whiskey needed care, equipment required maintenance, and survival demanded attention to immediate concerns. The mountains were harsh teachers, but they were also honest ones. His morning routine had become as reliable as sunrise. Wake before dawn, check the weather, tend to whiskey's needs, assess food and water supplies, plan the day's activities. Coffee was a luxury he permitted himself when supplies allowed, but more often breakfast was cold biscuit and whatever protein he could manage. Jerky if he was fortunate, nothing if he wasn't. Whiskey fared better thanks to Jed's skill with snares and his knowledge of which streams held trout. The old dog had adapted to their circumstances with typical canine resilience, though Jed noticed signs that Whiskey was feeling his age too. The hound moved more carefully on cold mornings, slept more deeply, and showed less enthusiasm for long hikes. But his loyalty never wavered, and his instincts remained sharp. More than once, Whiskey's alert behavior had warned Jed of approaching weather or nearby wildlife that could pose threats. This particular morning felt different, though Jed couldn't quite identify why. The air carried a hint of change, not just the seasonal shift toward winter, but something more immediate and specific. Whiskey seemed to sense it too, lifting his head frequently to test scents that the wind brought from the valley below. The dog's behavior wasn't alarmed exactly, but it suggested attention to something beyond their usual routine. As they prepared to break camp and head toward Millerville for supplies, Jed found himself thinking about purpose. For most of his adult life, he'd had clear roles: husband, provider, community member. Those identities had given structure to his days and meaning to his efforts. Now, stripped of conventional responsibilities, he sometimes wondered what justified his continued existence. Was he just postponing the inevitable, or was there still some contribution he could make? The question felt particularly sharp this morning as he rolled his sleeping bag and secured it to his pack. Martha's observation about his thinning frame wasn't wrong, and he knew that another hard winter in the mountains might be beyond his capabilities. But the alternative, charity, dependence, slow decline in some rest home, seemed worse than whatever risks the wilderness might hold. Whiskey's sudden bark interrupted these dark thoughts. The dog stood at attention, looking down the game trail that led toward the main road. His tail wagged slowly, suggesting interest rather than alarm. Following the dog's gaze, Jed saw movement through the trees. Someone approaching on foot, moving with the careful pace of someone carrying a burden. As the figure drew closer, Jed recognized Pete Garrison, a local trapper and sometime trading partner. Pete was perhaps 50 years old, with the kind of weathered competence that mountain life developed in those tough enough to survive it. He carried a heavy pack and led a pack mule loaded with supplies, but his expression suggested this wasn't a routine trading expedition. "Morning, Jed," Pete called as he approached the camp. "Mind if I rest these old bones for a minute? Got something might interest you." The meeting felt significant somehow, though Jed couldn't say why. As he watched Pete approach, Whiskey's tail continued its slow, thoughtful wagging, as if the dog also sensed that this encounter might change the shape of their carefully ordered existence. Pete Garrison set down his pack with the careful movements of a man who knew the value of conserving energy. His weathered face carried news, and Jed could read the signs well enough after decades of mountain life. When a man approached your camp before full daylight with that particular expression, he wasn't just passing through. "Coffee's about gone," Jed offered, gesturing toward the tin pot. "But you're welcome to what's left." "Obliged," Pete said, accepting the cup with hands that bore the permanent stains of trap work and animal processing. He sipped the bitter brew and studied Jed's sparse camp with the kind of assessment that came natural to men who lived close to the edge. "Been thinking about you lately, Jed. Heard from Martha that you're having a lean stretch." Jed felt his jaw tighten slightly. Mountain courtesy demanded that such observations be wrapped in careful language, but the underlying message was clear. "Enough. Getting by," he replied, using the standard response that preserved dignity while acknowledging reality. "Well, that's what I wanted to talk about." Pete reached into his pack and withdrew something wrapped in oiled cloth. "Found this yesterday at old Harlon's trading post up near Whistle Creek. Harlon's closing down, selling off whatever he can't take with him. Thought it might serve your purposes." The object Pete unwrapped was a photograph, not of the item itself, but showing what appeared to be an old wagon in terrible condition. The image was blurry, taken hastily, but it showed a decrepit vehicle with missing wheels, rotted canvas, and boards that had clearly seen decades of weather. "Harlon wants $1 for it," Pete continued. "I know that sounds like money you don't have, but hear me out. The frame's still solid oak, seasoned better than anything you could buy new. Wheels are gone, but the axles are good iron. Canvas is worthless. but there's enough good lumber there to build yourself a decent shelter. Better than sleeping rough through another winter." Jed studied the photograph, his practical eye automatically cataloguing what he could see. The wagon had once been a substantial piece of equipment, probably built for serious frontier travel. Even in its current state, he could recognize quality construction beneath the decay. A man with the right skills and enough time could indeed salvage something useful from the wreck. "Dollar's all I've got," Jed admitted, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Admitting poverty never got easier, no matter how often necessity demanded it. "I figured as much," Pete said gently. "That's why I thought of you first. Harlon's not looking to get rich. He just wants to see the thing go to someone who'll use it instead of letting it rot completely. Says it's been sitting behind his place for near 20 years, ever since some drifter abandoned it for back taxes on supplies." Whiskey had been listening to this conversation with the kind of attention dogs paid when they sense their human's emotional state changing. Now the old hound moved closer to Jed, pressing his warm flank against his master's leg in the gesture of support that had become familiar over their years together. The decision felt larger than it should have. $1 for a pile of rotting wood and rusted metal. It wasn't much of a gamble in pure financial terms, but for a man whose entire liquid wealth could be held in one hand, that dollar represented security, options, the difference between eating and going hungry for several days. Spending it would be an act of faith in his own abilities, a bet that his skills could transform junk into shelter. "Where exactly is this wagon?" Jed asked, though he was already beginning to make his decision. Something about the photograph stirred his interest beyond mere practical considerations. The wagon's lines, even hidden beneath decay, suggested it had been built with care by someone who understood both craftsmanship and the demands of frontier life. "Harlon's place is about 6 miles up the creek trail," Pete replied. "Easy walking, even with that pack of yours. If you decided to take it, I could help you get it back to wherever you want to work on it. Got my mule, and I owe you for that advice about trap placement you gave me last spring." The mention of past favors touched something deep in Jed's pride. He'd always been a man who paid his debts and expected others to do the same, but these days the balance sheet ran heavily against him. Having someone acknowledge a favor he'd done, even a small one, reminded him that he still had value beyond charity. "Appreciate the offer," Jed said, then took a deep breath. "Reckon I'll take a look at this wagon. If it's as solid as you think, might be worth the gamble." Pete's weathered face creased into a smile. "Good man. Harlon will be glad to see it go to someone who knows what to do with tools. He's been feeling guilty about letting it waste away, but he never had use for it himself." Within an hour, they had broken camp and begun the trek toward Whistle Creek. Jed carried his full pack, modest as it was, while Pete led his loaded mule along trails that wound through dense forest and across rocky creek beds. Whiskey ranged. Ahead and behind, his old instincts still sharp enough to scout for potential problems or interesting scents. The morning was crisp and clear, the kind of day that made the mountains seem like the finest place on earth to draw breath. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in shifting patterns, and the air carried the clean scents of pine resin, damp earth, and the faint wood smoke from distant chimneys. Despite his circumstances, or perhaps because of them, Jed felt his spirits lifting as they walked. There was something hopeful about moving toward a decision, about taking action instead of simply enduring. Harlon's trading post appeared around a bend in the trail, like something from an earlier century. The main building was constructed of massive logs, chinked with moss and clay, with a roof of split cedar shakes that had weathered to silver gray. A wide porch ran across the front, supported by posts that showed the marks of careful axework. Various sheds and outbuildings clustered around the main structure, and the whole complex had the look of a place that had served its purpose faithfully for decades. Harlon himself emerged from the main building as they approached, a man of perhaps 65, with white hair and beard that gave him the appearance of a frontier patriarch. His eyes were sharp and kind, and his handshake carried the strength of someone who'd spent his life working with his hands. "Pete said you might be interested in that old wagon," Harlon said without preamble. Mountain folks didn't waste time on excessive pleasantries when business was at hand. "It's around back. Fair warning, she looks worse than she is, but she's still pretty rough." The wagon sat in a clearing behind the trading post, partially sheltered by a lean-to that had protected it from the worst weather. Even so, 20 years of mountain winters had taken their toll. The canvas top was completely gone, leaving only the metal frame ribs poking up like the bones of some great beast. The wooden sides showed extensive rot, and moss had claimed much of the surface. But as Pete had promised, the basic structure remained sound. Jed walked slowly around the wagon, his experienced eye reading the story of its construction and decline. The frame was indeed solid oak, joined with the kind of careful mortise and tenon work that spoke of genuine craftsmanship. The iron hardware was rusted but intact, and the wheel hubs showed the wear patterns of a vehicle that had seen serious use before its abandonment. "She's a beauty under all that rot," Harlon observed, watching Jed's inspection. Built by the Studebaker Company back in the 1860s, according to the metal plate on the tongue. Meant for serious frontier travel, not just local hauling. Someone invested real money in this rig. As Jed examined the wagon box more closely, his fingers traced the edges of what appeared to be a deliberate modification. The floorboards didn't quite match the rest of the construction, and there seemed to be an irregularity in the spacing. His carpenter's instincts, honed by decades of woodworking, suggested that someone had created a hidden compartment beneath the main cargo area. "Harlon," he said carefully, "you ever look inside this thing? I mean, really examine the floor construction?" The older man shrugged. "Never had call to. Why? You see something interesting?" Instead of answering directly, Jed continued his examination, running his hands along the floorboards until he found what he was looking for, a section that gave slightly under pressure, suggesting it wasn't permanently attached. With Pete and Harlon watching curiously, he worked his fingers around the edges until he found the hidden catch. The section of flooring lifted away to reveal a space about 2 feet square and perhaps 8 inches deep. Inside, wrapped in what had once been oiled leather but was now stiff and cracked with age, were 2 objects that made all 3 men catch their breath. The first was a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed but still intact thanks to the protection of the hidden compartment. The second was a small metal lockbox, green with age but solid enough to suggest it might still contain whatever its original owner had thought worth hiding. "Well, I'll be damned," Harlon whispered, his voice carrying the awe of someone who'd just witnessed something extraordinary. 20 years I've walked past this old wreck, and all the time it was keeping a secret. Jed lifted the journal carefully, feeling the weight of years and stories in his hands. The leather cover bore no identifying marks, but the careful way it had been wrapped and hidden suggested it contained something of real importance to whoever had placed it there. "Reckon this changes the price?" he asked Harlon, though his tone carried more curiosity than concern. Harlon shook his head firmly. "A deal's a deal. Besides, whatever's in there belongs to whoever had the sense to look for it. That'd be you, Jed. Dollar still buys you the wagon and whatever secrets it's been keeping." As Jed handed over his last silver dollar, he felt as though he were purchasing something far more significant than a rotted wagon and some mysterious artifacts. He was buying himself back into the world of possibility, of purpose, of stories that mattered. Whatever lay within that journal and lockbox, it had waited more than 20 years for someone to discover it. The real question now was whether he was prepared for whatever truths those pages might contain. That evening, back at his camp with the wagon's treasures safely secured, Jed sat by lamplight with the journal spread carefully on his lap. Whiskey lay beside him, the old dog's warmth a comfort against the mountain chill that settled with darkness. The leather-bound book felt fragile in his weathered hands, its pages brittle with age, but still legible in the flickering light. The first entry was dated March 15, 1867, written in the careful script of someone who took pride in proper penmanship. The ink had faded to brown, but the words remained clear enough to transport Jed back through the decades to a time when the Oregon Territory was still raw frontier and dreams came wrapped in danger. Today we begin our journey westward with hopes, high and hearts determined. Thomas has sold our farm in Missouri for enough to buy proper supplies and this fine wagon. Little Emma asks every mile when we will see the ocean, and I tell her soon enough, though I confess I share her eagerness. The Lord has blessed us with fair weather and good health. Surely these are signs that our venture will prosper. The author identified herself as Mary Brennan, and as Jed read on, she painted a picture of a family driven by the same dreams that had lured thousands to the Oregon Territory: land, opportunity, and the chance to build something lasting in a new place. Her husband, Thomas, was described as a skilled carpenter and occasional prospector, a man with gentle hands and ambitious plans. Their daughter Emma was 7 years old, bright as a new penny, and full of questions about the world they were traveling toward. Jed found himself drawn into their story with an intensity that surprised him. Perhaps it was the loneliness of his current circumstances, or maybe the journal's intimate tone that made these long-dead strangers feel like neighbors he'd somehow missed meeting. As he turned the pages, their hopes became his hopes. Their fears resonated in his chest. The early entries chronicled the typical hardships of wagon train travel: broken axles, difficult river crossings, sickness, and the constant worry about supplies. But the Brennan family seemed blessed with both luck and determination. Thomas's carpentry skills made him valuable to other travelers, while Mary's knowledge of herbs and healing earned her a reputation as someone worth knowing. Emma, according to her mother's fond descriptions, charmed everyone she met with her curiosity and fearless spirit. Thomas has made a discovery that may change our fortunes entirely, Mary wrote in an entry dated July 3, 1867. While helping repair the Johnson wagon near a creek crossing, he noticed flakes of what he believes to be gold in the gravel. We have said nothing to the others, but Thomas spent yesterday evening panning a small amount that confirms his suspicions. Could the Lord have led us to such bounty by accident? Thomas says we must be cautious and tell no one until we can properly file a claim. The discovery of gold had clearly energized the family, but Mary's subsequent entries revealed a woman torn between excitement and worry. Gold brought opportunity, but it also attracted dangerous attention. The Brennans had left the main wagon, trained to explore Thomas's find, planning to rejoin the group after establishing their claim. That decision, Jed realized as he read, had likely saved their lives initially, but ultimately sealed their fate. The claim is richer than we dared hope, Mary wrote 3 weeks later. Thomas has built a proper sluice, and in just these few days, we have recovered enough gold to pay for our entire journey twice over. Emma delights in helping wash the gravel, though we must watch her carefully around the water. She has named our creek Shining Water and insists we should build our permanent home here rather than continuing to the Willamette Valley. Perhaps she is wiser than we know, but the tone of the entries began to change as July turned to August. Mary mentioned strangers asking questions in the nearest settlement, men who seemed too interested in travelers who had left the main wagon train. Thomas had filed his claim properly at the territorial office, but word of a significant gold discovery had clearly spread beyond official channels. A man came to our camp today, well-dressed, but with eyes like winter ice. He introduced himself as Silas Moorcock and claimed to represent investors interested in purchasing mining claims. Thomas told him politely that we are not selling, but the man did not seem to hear refusal in the words. He examined our operation with the attention of someone memorizing details, and his questions about our family felt more like threats wrapped in courtesy. I fear we have drawn attention we cannot handle, Jed paused in his reading, struck by the name Morco. In his decades of mountain life, he'd heard that surname mentioned in connection with various business dealings, usually involving land and mining claims. The family had maintained influence in regional affairs for generations, though their methods had always been whispered about rather than openly discussed. If this was the same bloodline, the Brennans had indeed attracted dangerous attention. The journal entries from late August painted an increasingly desperate picture. Morco had returned several times, each visit more threatening than the last. He claimed that Thomas's claim overlapped with prior claims held by his associates, and he produced documents that seemed to support his assertion. When Thomas challenged these papers at the territorial office, he discovered that the officials who had originally processed his claim had been replaced, and the new clerks seemed remarkably sympathetic to Morco's position. Thomas rode to the territorial capital yesterday to seek help from higher authorities, but I fear it is already too late. While he was gone, Morco arrived with armed men who searched our camp and took samples of our ore. They were polite in their words, but violent in their actions. When I protested, one of them suggested that accidents happened frequently in remote mining camps, especially to families who did not understand the dangers of their situation. I have hidden this journal and our remaining gold in the place Thomas and I agreed upon. If something happens to us, perhaps someone will find this record and understand what became of the Brennan family. The final entries were hurried, the handwriting less careful as fear overcame Mary's natural attention to penmanship. Thomas had returned from the territorial capital with news that Morco's influence extended even to the highest levels of government. Officials who should have protected legitimate settlers seemed more interested in maintaining profitable relationships with established interests like the Morco family. We leave tonight with what we can carry. Thomas has drawn a map showing where we buried our remaining gold and supplies, hoping we can return when this madness passes. Emma does not understand why we must abandon our beautiful creek, and my heart breaks to see her confusion. She asks why the bad men want to take our shining water, and I have no answer that a 7-year-old could comprehend. Thomas says we will go north toward the Columbia, where his cousin may shelter us until we can find help. I pray we see another sunrise together. The final entry was dated September 12, 1867, and consisted of only a few lines written in obvious haste. They have found us. Thomas says to take Emma and run while he delays them. I am burying this journal in our old hiding place with Thomas's map. If God wills it, we will return. If not, may someone find this record and know that we died trying to protect our daughter's future. The map shows where we buried our savings at the claim. Emma's doll is buried with it. Thomas said even if we lose everything else, she should have something to remember her childhood by. Forgive me, Lord, for what we could not prevent. Jed closed the journal gently, his hands trembling with more than cold. Somewhere in these mountains, the bones of Thomas, Mary, and little Emma Brennan lay unburied and unmourned. Their gold claim, stolen through violence and corruption, had probably enriched the Morco family for generations, and their story, hidden in a rotting wagon for more than 50 years, had waited all this time for someone to bear witness to their tragedy. Beside him, Whiskey whined softly, sensing his master's emotional turmoil. Jed reached down to stroke the old dog's head, finding comfort in the simple gesture. But his mind was already working, processing the implications of what he'd read. The hand-drawn map Mary mentioned was probably in the lockbox, along with whatever other evidence the family had managed to preserve. The question was what, if anything, a 73-year-old mountain man could do about injustices that were older than most of the trees surrounding his camp. The lockbox proved more stubborn than the journal. Its brass lock had corroded with age but still held firm, and Jed spent the better part of the next morning working to open it without damaging whatever lay inside. Finally, using a thin piece of metal salvaged from the wagon and considerable patience, he managed to work the mechanism free. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that had better preserved its contents, lay the promised map along with other items that made Jed's breath catch in his throat. Thomas Brennan had drawn his map with the careful attention of a man who understood that lives might depend on its accuracy. The landmarks were clearly marked: creek bends, distinctive rock formations, and tree patterns that would still be recognizable. After decades, if a person knew how to read the land, but it was the other contents of the box that struck Jed most powerfully. There was a small gold nugget, probably kept as proof of the claim's richness, and a folded paper that proved to be the original claim filing with official stamps and signatures. More importantly, there was a tintype photograph showing the Brennan family in happier times. Thomas, with his carpenter's strong hands resting on Mary's shoulders, while little Emma stood between them with a bright smile and eyes full of mischief. Tati, child in the photograph, bore an uncanny resemblance to Jed's own granddaughter, whom he'd lost touch with after Sarah's death. Emma Brennan had the same fearless expression, the same way of standing, as if ready to dash off on some grand adventure. The similarity hit him like a physical blow, connecting these long-dead strangers to his own heart in ways he hadn't expected. Beneath the photograph lay the most heartbreaking discovery of all: a small cloth doll, its fabric faded but still intact. This had to be Emma's treasured companion, the one Mary had mentioned burying with their gold. Someone, probably Thomas, in his final desperate hours, had retrieved it from their cache and placed it in the lockbox, perhaps hoping his daughter would somehow be reunited with her beloved toy. Jed held the tiny doll in his weathered hands, imagining the little girl who had carried it across the country, who had named a creek Shining Water and asked innocent questions about why bad men wanted to steal their home. The weight of injustice settled on his shoulders like a familiar pack, and he found himself making a silent promise to Emma Brennan's memory. The map proved surprisingly easy to follow once Jed oriented himself to the landmarks Thomas had so carefully recorded. The claim lay about 8 miles northwest of his current camp, in country that Jed knew reasonably well from his trapping days. According to the map, Shining Water Creek was what folks now called Miners Creek, a tributary that had indeed seen placer mining activity over the decades since the Brennans' disappearance. With whiskey ranging ahead, Jed made his way toward the marked location, the doll carefully wrapped and carried in his pack alongside the journal and map. The autumn air was crisp and clean, carrying the scents of pine and wood smoke from distant chimneys. Under different circumstances, it would have been a pleasant hike through country that still held the wild beauty that had drawn settlers like the Brennans westward. He found the creek without difficulty, following Thomas's landmarks to a bend, where the water ran shallow over a gravel bar that still showed signs of old mining activity. Somewhere in this peaceful valley, a family's dreams had died violently, and their story had been buried along with their bones. Jed spent the afternoon systematically searching the area, reading the land for signs that most people would miss. His decades of outdoor experience had taught him to see the subtle indicators that revealed human activity: the slightly unnatural arrangement of stones, the depression where a cabin might once have stood, the places where vegetation grew differently because the soil had been disturbed. Near a cluster of large boulders that matched Thomas's description, he found what he was looking for: the remains of a stone fire ring, almost completely overgrown, but still visible to experienced eyes. Nearby, barely perceptible depressions in the earth suggested where a tent or small cabin had once stood. And scattered through the area, the kind of small metal objects that accumulate around any long-term camp: rusted cans, a broken knife blade, buckles from leather goods that had long since rotted away. But it was whiskey who made the most significant discovery. The old dog had been investigating a natural depression near the creek bank, whining softly and pawing at something that caught his attention. When Jed joined him, he found what appeared to be mining tools. A rusty pan, parts of a wooden sluice box, and several hand tools that matched the kind Thomas would have used in his gold recovery operation. The tools were hidden beneath decades of accumulated leaves and debris, but their presence confirmed that this was indeed the Brennan claim. More importantly, they suggested that the family had been forced to abandon their operation quickly, leaving behind equipment that would have been valuable and difficult to replace. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Jed expanded his search. Compartment, looking for the burial site Thomas had marked on his map. According to the carefully drawn directions, the family's emergency cache lay 30 paces northeast of the main camp, marked by a distinctive split boulder that should still be identifiable. He found the boulder easily enough, a granite formation, perhaps 8 feet tall, that had been split by frost and weather into 2 distinct pieces with a narrow gap between them. But as he examined the area around its base, looking for signs of disturbed earth, Whiskey began behaving strangely. The old dog approached one particular spot near the boulder's base and then backed away, whining and showing the kind of distress that Jed had learned to take seriously. Dogs sense things that humans missed, and Whiskey's behavior suggested something that disturbed him on a primal level. Kneeling beside his companion, Jed began carefully brushing away leaves and debris from the spot that had captured Whiskey's attention. What he uncovered made him sit back on his heels with a sharp intake of breath. Partially buried in what had once been soft earth, now packed hard by decades of weather, were unmistakably human remains. Not a complete skeleton, but enough bone, fragments and teeth to confirm his worst fears. The Brennan family's flight had ended here, in this peaceful valley where they'd hoped to build their future. But these weren't the remains of adults. The size and characteristics of the bones were those of a child, little Emma, who had asked innocent questions about shining water and bad men, who had carried her cloth doll across a continent only to die in terror and confusion in this remote place. Jed's hands shook as he gently covered the bones again, his mind struggling with the enormity of what he'd discovered. This wasn't just history anymore. It was evidence of murder, proof that the Morco family's wealth had been built on the graves of innocents. The gold claim, stolen through violence and corruption, had probably been passed down through generations who either didn't know or didn't care about the blood that stained their inheritance. As darkness began to settle over the valley, Jed made his way back toward his camp with Whiskey close beside him. The old dog seemed to understand the solemnity of what they'd discovered, staying unusually close to his master's side as they navigated the familiar trails. But halfway back to camp, they encountered something that made both man and dog freeze in their tracks. Fresh tire marks in the soft earth beside the trail, and the unmistakable signs that someone had been watching the area recently. Boot prints in the mud, cigarette butts that hadn't been weathered by more than a day or two, and the kind of disturbed vegetation that suggested people had been moving through the area with vehicles. Someone else knew about the Brennan claim. And based on the evidence Jed was seeing, they were actively investigating the same area he'd been exploring. The question was whether their interest was historical, or whether the Morco family's legacy of violence was about to claim new victims. The next morning brought unwelcome visitors to Jed's camp. He woke to Whiskey's low growling, a sound the old dog reserved for genuine threats rather than casual wildlife encounters. Through the pre-dawn gloom, Jed could make out 2 figures approaching on foot, moving with the confident stride of people who were accustomed to getting their way. The first was a man in his 40s, well-dressed in outdoor gear that looked expensive but unused. His companion was younger, perhaps 30, with the kind of build that suggested regular gym time and the attitude that came with it. Both carried themselves with an air of authority that immediately put Jed on edge. "You, Jedediah Cole?" the older Man asked without preamble. His voice carried the educated accent of someone who'd grown up with privilege, but there was steel underneath the polish. Name's Clayton Morco. This is my associate, Mr. Stevens. We need to have a conversation. The surname hit Jed like a physical blow, though he kept his expression carefully neutral. After decades of mountain life, he'd learned the value of not revealing what he was thinking until he understood the situation completely. Depends on what kind of conversation you're looking for, he replied, staying seated by his campfire but keeping his hands free. Clayton smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. The kind where we discuss your recent interest in local history, specifically your visit yesterday to property that belongs to my family. Property where you had no business being. Jed felt whiskey press closer against his leg, the dog's instincts clearly marking these men as threats. Public land, last I checked. Man's got a right to walk where he pleases, long as he doesn't damage anything. Public land, Clayton repeated, as if tasting something unpleasant. That's an interesting interpretation. See, my family has held mining claims in that area for over 50 years. Claims that we've maintained and protected, even when they weren't actively being worked. Claims that give us certain rights that supersede casual hiking privileges. The younger man, Stevens, spoke for the first time. What Mr. Morco is trying to say is that we know you found something yesterday, something that doesn't belong to you. His tone carried the kind of casual menace that suggested he was comfortable with violence. Jed's mind raced, weighing options and calculating odds. These men clearly knew about his discovery, which meant they'd been watching him longer than just yesterday. That level of surveillance suggested resources and organization that went beyond casual interest. The Morco family had evolved with the times, but their methods apparently remained the same. Don't know what you're talking about, Jed said carefully. Just an old man taking walks with his dog. Nothing illegal about that. Clayton's smile grew colder. Mr. Cole, let me be direct. Yesterday you visited the site of an old mining claim that my great-great-grandfather acquired legally in 1867. You spent considerable time there, and you took something that belongs to my family. I want it back. The casual mention of 1867 confirmed Jed's worst fears. This wasn't coincidence. The Morco family knew exactly what had happened to the Brennans, and they'd spent generations covering it up. Clayton's presence here meant that Jed's discovery posed a genuine threat to whatever version of history they'd constructed to legitimize their wealth. Even if I had found something, Jed said slowly, how would you know it belonged to your family? Unless you've been keeping pretty close track of things that most folks would have forgotten by now. Stevens shifted his weight, and Jed caught a glimpse of shoulder holster beneath his jacket. The message was clear without being explicitly stated. This conversation could go in several different directions, and not all of them involved Jed walking away intact. My family keeps excellent records, Clayton replied. We've always been careful about documenting our business dealings. What happened in 1867 was a legitimate acquisition of mining rights from people who couldn't meet their obligations. Tragic, perhaps, but entirely legal under the territorial laws of the time. The smoothness of the lie revealed just how long the Morcocks had been refining their version of events. 3 generations had probably been raised on this sanitized story, with each telling moving further away from the bloody truth. Clayton might even believe his own family's mythology, though his presence here suggested he understood the stakes involved in maintaining it. Funny thing about legal, Jed observed, keeping his tone conversational. Sometimes what's legal and what's right don't quite line up. Sometimes folks in positions of power make laws that benefit themselves more than they protect innocent people. Clayton's facade slipped slightly, revealing something harder and more dangerous underneath. Philosophy is interesting, Mr. Cole, but it doesn't change practical realities. My family has held those claims legally for over 50 years. We've paid taxes, filed proper documents, and maintained our rights through every change in territorial and state law. Whatever romantic notions you might have about historical injustices, the law is on our side. Maybe, Jed said, his hand moving casually to where Whiskey could see it. The old dog had been trained in his younger years to respond to subtle signals, and while age had slowed his reflexes, his protective instincts remained sharp. But the law has a funny way of changing when new evidence comes to light, especially evidence that shows how those original claims were acquired. Stevens took a step forward, his hand moving toward his jacket, but Clayton stopped him with a slight gesture. "Mr. Cole, I think you misunderstand the situation. This isn't a negotiation. You're going to return what you took, and you're going to forget you ever found it. In exchange, we'll forget this conversation ever happened. And if I don't see things—" "Your way," Clayton's smile returned, but now it carried open menace. "Then we'll be forced to consider other options. You're a long way from help out here, Mr. Cole. Mountain country can be dangerous for people who don't understand the risks. Accidents happen. People get lost. Sometimes they're never found." The threat was delivered with the casual tone of someone discussing weather, but Jed recognized the steel behind it. This was the same family that had murdered the Brennans, and their willingness to use violence hadn't diminished with the generations. If anything, their wealth and influence had probably made them more dangerous, not less. "I'll need some time to think about your offer," Jed said finally. "Of course," Clayton replied, though his tone suggested limited patience. "But don't take too long. We're reasonable people, but our patience isn't unlimited. 24 hours should be sufficient to make the right decision." As the two men turned to leave, Clayton paused and looked back. "Oh, and Mr. Cole, don't consider involving local authorities. Sheriff Morrison is a practical man who understands the economic realities of this region. My family employs a lot of people, and we contribute significantly to the local tax base. I'm sure you can imagine where his loyalties lie when it comes to choosing between established community members and transient troublemakers." With that parting shot, the two men disappeared into the forest as quietly as they'd arrived, leaving Jed alone with Whiskey and the growing certainty that he'd stumbled into something far more dangerous than a historical mystery. The original deed certificate, carefully preserved in the lockbox for over 50 years, suddenly felt like more than just evidence of past crimes. It was proof of ongoing fraud, documentation that could destroy the Morco family's carefully constructed legitimacy. And as Clayton had made clear, they were prepared to kill to protect their secrets, just as their ancestor had killed the Brennans. The question now was what a 73-year-old mountain man and his aging dog could do against a family with generations of wealth, influence, and experience in making problems disappear. Jed spent the rest of that morning carefully considering his options, none of which seemed particularly promising. Clayton's threat about Sheriff Morrison rang true. The Morco family had probably been cultivating relationships with local law enforcement for generations. Even if Jed could convince someone to listen to his story, it would be his word against a prominent family's carefully maintained reputation. But as he sat, studying the photograph of the Brennan family, something stubborn crystallized in his chest. These people deserved better than to be forgotten, their deaths covered up by lies and intimidation. Emma's innocent face seemed to look directly at him from the faded tintype, asking why the bad men had been allowed to win. Around midday, Whiskey's ears perked up at the sound of an approaching vehicle. This time, however, the visitor was someone Jed recognized. Martha Henderson's battered pickup truck, loaded with supplies and moving at the careful pace of someone who respected mountain roads. She parked at the edge of his camp and climbed out with the practical movements of a woman who'd spent her life in country that demanded both strength and caution. "Thought you might be needing supplies," Martha said, though her sharp eyes were already assessing Jed's camp with the attention of someone who knew how to read signs of trouble. "Pete Garrison mentioned you'd made a purchase yesterday. Figured you might be working on some kind of project." Martha had been part of these mountains for over 30 years, and she understood the delicate balance of offering help without damaging pride. Her general store served as an informal information center for the scattered population, and she'd developed the kind of instincts that kept communities functioning despite their isolation. "Appreciate the thought," Jed replied, though he found himself scanning the tree line for signs that Clayton might have left watchers. "Been doing some thinking about local history lately. Amazing how much gets forgotten over the years." "History's a funny thing," Martha agreed, beginning to unload boxes from her truck. "Some stories get told and retold until they take on a life of their own. Others get buried so deep that people forget they ever happened." She paused in her work, studying Jed's expression. "Course, sometimes buried stories have a way of working themselves back to the surface." The careful phrasing suggested that Martha knew more about the situation than she was saying directly. Mountain communities had long memories and informal networks that carried information in ways that outsiders rarely understood. If Clayton Morco had been making inquiries about Jed, Martha would likely have heard about it through channels that didn't involve official law enforcement. "Martha," Jed said slowly, "what do you know about the Morco family? Not the gossip, but the real history." She finished unloading a box of canned goods before answering, using the time to consider her words carefully. "They've been powerful in these parts for a long time. Started in mining, moved into timber. Now they've got their fingers in everything from real estate to local politics. Always been rumors about how they got their start, but rumors are dangerous things to repeat without proof." "What kind of rumors?" Martha glanced around the camp, her experienced eyes noting details that confirmed her suspicions about Jed's recent activities. The carefully preserved journal, the old photograph partially visible among his belongings, the way Whiskey kept looking toward the tree line as if expecting trouble, all of it painted a picture that aligned with information she'd been gathering. Through her own channels, the kind that suggests their original wealth came from claims that might not have been acquired as legally as their family history maintains, she said finally. Stories about families who disappeared right around the time the Morcocks suddenly became prosperous. Nothing anyone could ever prove, but enough smoke to suggest there might have been fire. She pulled a thermos from her truck and poured coffee into 2 cups, handing one to Jed with the kind of gesture that invited confidence. "I also know that Clayton Morco has been asking questions around town about an old mountain man who's been poking around historical sites. Seems he's concerned about people disturbing things that should be left alone." The confirmation of Clayton's surveillance activities wasn't surprising, but it emphasized how quickly Jed's situation was deteriorating. If the Morcocks were actively monitoring his movements and making inquiries about him, it suggested they viewed him as a genuine threat, rather than just a nuisance to be dismissed. "Martha, if someone found evidence of historical crimes, real evidence, not just rumors, what would be the best way to make sure that evidence saw daylight?" She sipped her coffee thoughtfully, her eyes studying the mountains that had been her home for decades. "Depends on what kind of evidence and how powerful the people involved might be. Local authorities might not be the best option if the families involved have deep roots and long memories. Sometimes you need to go outside the usual channels." "What do you mean?" "Well," Martha said carefully, "there's a woman in the county seat who works for the Historical Society, Sarah McKenna. She's got a reputation for taking historical injustices seriously, and she's not afraid to ask uncomfortable questions when she thinks the official story doesn't match the evidence. More importantly, she's got connections with university researchers and journalists who specialize in Western history." The name Sarah struck Jed with unexpected force. It was his late wife's name, and hearing it in this context felt like more than coincidence. Perhaps it was a sign that he was on the right path, or maybe just the kind of meaningful connection that desperate people found when they needed hope. "She might be interested in seeing what you found," Martha continued, "assuming, of course, that what you found is significant enough to warrant outside attention. The kind of attention that powerful families can't control through local influence. Before Jed could respond, Whiskey suddenly stood and began growling, his attention focused on something in the forest beyond the camp. Martha noticed the dog's behavior immediately, her own instincts sharpened by years of mountain life. Without being obvious about it, she positioned herself where she could see both the tree line and her truck. "Might be time for me to head back to town," she said casually, though her tone carried an undercurrent of urgency. "But before I go, let me give you Sarah McKenna's contact information, just in case you decide you want to discuss local history with someone who appreciates its importance." She pulled a small notebook from her pocket and tore out a page, writing quickly before handing it to Jed. "She's usually at the Historical Society on weekdays, but her home number's there too. Tell her Martha Henderson suggested you get in touch." As Martha climbed back into her truck, she paused with her hand on the door handle. "Jed, whatever you've stumbled into, be careful. Some secrets have been kept secret for good reasons, but others have been kept secret for bad ones. The trick is knowing which kind you're dealing with before you get in too deep." After her truck disappeared down the mountain road, Jed found himself alone with his thoughts and the growing certainty that his 24-hour deadline was approaching faster than he'd like. The photograph of the Brennan family seemed to watch him from where it lay on his camp table. 3 faces from the past, asking for justice that might cost him his life to deliver. But as he looked at little Emma's innocent smile, Jed realized that some things were worth the risk. These people had died for no better reason than one man's greed and another's willingness to use violence to get what he wanted. If their story could finally be told, if their deaths could finally mean something, then perhaps an old man's life was a reasonable price to pay for justice delayed but not denied. The question was whether he could survive long enough to see the story reach the light of day. That afternoon, Jed made the decision that would change everything. Rather than wait for Clayton's deadline to expire, he loaded his essential belongings and set out for the county seat with Whiskey at his side. The old dog seemed to sense the gravity of their situation, staying closer than usual as they made their way down mountain trails that Jed had walked for decades. Sarah McKenna's office at the Historical Society occupied the second floor of a converted Victorian mansion that had been donated to the county for cultural purposes. The building retained its original character: high ceilings, tall windows, and the kind of solid construction that spoke of an era when people built things to last. Jed found himself unexpectedly nervous as he climbed the wooden stairs, the journal and lockbox contents secure in his weathered pack. Sarah McKenna proved to be a woman in her early 50s, with graying brown hair and the kind of intelligent eyes that suggested she'd spent her career looking beneath surface appearances to find deeper truths. Her office was organized chaos: filing cabinets overflowing with documents, bookshelves lined with historical references, and several tables covered with photographs and maps related to various research projects. "Martha Henderson called ahead," Sarah said after introductions were complete. "She mentioned you'd discovered something related to local mining history that might be significant. I have to admit, she's got excellent instincts about these things." Jed found himself hesitating, suddenly aware of how extraordinary his story would sound to someone who hadn't lived through the discovery process. But Emma's photograph, carefully preserved in the lockbox for over 50 years, seemed to encourage him to continue. "Ma'am, what I'm about to show you might be hard to believe," he began, then methodically laid out the evidence: the journal, the photograph, the deed, and the tiny doll that had somehow survived decades of hiding. Sarah's professional skepticism melted away as she examined each artifact with growing amazement. Her hands trembled slightly as she read Mary Brennan's final entries, and when she saw the photograph of the family, tears gathered in her eyes. "My God," she whispered, "this is extraordinary. Do you realize what you've found? This isn't just a family tragedy. This is documentation of systematic fraud and murder that could rewrite our understanding of regional development during the territorial period." "There's more," Jed said quietly, then told her about his discovery. of Emma's remains and his confrontation with Clayton Morco. Sarah's expression grew increasingly grim as she understood the current dangers that surrounded the historical evidence. "We need to document everything immediately," she said, reaching for her camera. "If the Morco family is willing to threaten you over this, they're obviously aware of how damaging these revelations could be. We need to create multiple copies and distribute them to people who can't be intimidated or bought." As Sarah carefully photographed each document and artifact, she shared her own knowledge of regional history that gave context to the Brennan tragedy. "I've been researching suspicious land acquisitions from that period for years," she explained. "The pattern is always the same. Legitimate settlers disappear or die under mysterious circumstances, and their claims are immediately acquired by the same group of connected families. But I've never had concrete evidence like this." She pulled out a large map of the region from the 1870s, marking locations where similar disappearances had occurred. "Look at this pattern. Within a 5-year period, 17 families simply vanished from their claims. All of them were small operators who'd made significant discoveries. All of their properties were acquired by the same network of buyers." The map revealed a conspiracy far larger than Jed had imagined. The Brennan family hadn't been isolated victims. They'd been part of a systematic campaign of theft and murder that had shaped the economic foundation of the entire region. Families like the Morcocks had built their fortunes on mass graves, and they'd spent generations covering their tracks. "Sarah," Jed said slowly, "if this evidence proves what you think it proves, what happens next?" Her expression was grim, but determined. "It means we're dealing with criminal enterprises that have operated with impunity for over a century. It means that some of the most respected families in the region are descended from murderers and thieves. And it means that powerful people are going to do whatever it takes to keep this information from becoming public." As if summoned by her words, the sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs interrupted their conversation. Sarah's office door burst open without ceremony, and Clayton Morco entered with 3 men who were obviously not there for historical research. Their faces were hard, their movements coordinated, and their intent clearly hostile. "Miss McKenna," Clayton said with cold politeness, "I'm afraid you're in possession of stolen property that belongs to my family. I'll need you to hand over any documents or artifacts that Mr. Cole may have shared with you." Sarah stood slowly, her hand moving toward the desk drawer, where Jed glimpsed the outline of what might be a small pistol. "Mr. Morco, these materials are evidence of historical crimes. They belong in the public record, not in your family's private collection." "That's a matter of interpretation," Clayton replied. "My family's legal team would disagree with your assessment. More importantly, your continued possession of stolen materials could be construed as receiving stolen goods, which is a felony under state law." One of Clayton's men, a large individual with the build of someone comfortable with violence, stepped forward menacingly. "Maybe we should just take what we came for and avoid any legal complications." But before anyone could act on the threat, Sarah's hand came up from her desk drawer, not with a weapon, but with a small digital recorder that had obviously been running throughout the conversation. "Gentlemen," she said calmly, "you've just threatened a state employee in the performance of her official duties. You've also effectively confessed to a conspiracy to suppress evidence of historical crimes. This entire conversation has been recorded and automatically uploaded to cloud storage that my office maintains for exactly these situations." Clayton's face flushed with rage, but before he could respond, Sarah continued. "More importantly, copies of all the materials Mr. Cole brought me have already been transmitted to researchers at 3 major universities, the State Attorney General's office, and 2 journalists who specialize in historical crime stories. Your family's secrets are no longer secret." The silence that followed was electric with tension. Clayton's men looked to him for direction, but he seemed stunned by the speed with which his carefully controlled situation had spiraled beyond his influence. "You have no idea what you've started," Clayton said finally, his voice carrying a cold fury that made even his own men look uncomfortable. "My family has been protecting this community for generations. We've provided jobs, supported local institutions, and maintained stability that benefits everyone. You're going to destroy all of that for the sake of people who died 50 years ago. Over a century ago," Sarah corrected quietly. "And they didn't just die, they were murdered by your ancestors for their gold. Everything your family has built is founded on mass murder, and it's time for that truth to be acknowledged." As Clayton and his men prepared to leave, he turned back with a final threat. "This isn't over. Not by a long shot. There are ways to handle problems that don't involve direct confrontation, ways that take time to arrange, but are very permanent in their resolution." After they left, Sarah immediately began making phone calls, while Jed sat in stunned silence, processing the enormity of what had just occurred. In the space of a few hours, his discovery of a rotted wagon had escalated into a confrontation with a criminal enterprise that had operated for over a century. "Jed," Sarah said after finishing her calls, "I've arranged for you to stay in protective custody until we can sort this out. The state police are taking this seriously, and they're coordinating with federal authorities who have jurisdiction over historical crimes involving territorial-era fraud." But Jed shook his head, surprising them both. "Appreciate the offer, but I've got something I need to finish first. That little girl's bones are still lying in an unmarked grave up in those mountains. Before anything else happens, she deserves a proper burial and a headstone with her real name on it." Sarah's eyes filled with understanding and respect. "Then we'd better work fast," she said, "because Clayton Morco just declared war on everyone involved in exposing his family's crimes, and men like that don't make idle threats." As they prepared to leave her office, Jed carefully wrapped Emma's doll in protective cloth, knowing that soon it would be returned to the child who had treasured it over a century ago. Justice had been a long time coming to the Brennan family, but perhaps it wasn't too late for the truth to finally matter more than the lies that had buried it. That evening, back in Sarah's home on the outskirts of town, Jed found himself studying a tarnished sheriff's badge that Sarah had retrieved from her office safe. The badge belonged to Deputy Marshal William Fletcher, who had mysteriously disappeared in 1868 while investigating reports of missing families in the mining regions. His body had never been found, but his badge had been discovered years later by a rancher who'd turned it over to the Historical Society without understanding its significance. Fletcher was getting close to the truth, Sarah explained, as she spread additional documents across her kitchen table. His reports show he'd identified the pattern of disappearances and was beginning to connect them to specific land acquisitions. Then he vanished, and his investigation was quietly closed by authorities who claimed lack of evidence. The badge felt heavy in Jed's weathered hands, its weight representing more than just metal and authority. Deputy Marshal Fletcher had been trying to do exactly what Jed was attempting now: bring justice to families who had been murdered for their claims. The fact that Fletcher had died for his efforts wasn't lost on either of them. "Sarah," Jed said quietly, "I've been thinking about what Clayton said earlier, about his family providing jobs and supporting the community. How many people are going to suffer when this story breaks?" It was a question that had been troubling him since they'd left the Historical Society. The Morco family's business empire probably employed hundreds of people throughout the region. Local banks, suppliers, and service companies had built their own prosperity around Morco money. Exposing the truth about the family's origins would send shockwaves through the entire economic structure of several communities. Sarah set down the documents she'd been organizing and gave him a look of profound respect. "That's exactly the question a good man would ask," she said. "But consider this. How many families over the past century have been denied justice because people were afraid of economic disruption? How many other crimes have been covered up because the perpetrators were too important to prosecute? She pulled out another folder, this one containing newspaper clippings and legal documents from more recent decades. The Morco family's influence didn't end with the territorial period. There are documented cases of environmental violations, worker safety issues, and union organizing efforts that were suppressed through intimidation and violence. The methods changed, but the mentality remained the same. As Jed examined the more recent evidence, a pattern emerged that was both familiar and disturbing. The Morcocks had continued to operate above the law, using their wealth and connections to avoid consequences for actions that would have destroyed ordinary families. Workers who complained about unsafe conditions found themselves blacklisted. Throughout the region, environmental activists who challenged their mining practices faced harassment that drove them out of the area. This isn't just about historical justice, Sarah continued. This is about breaking a cycle of abuse that's been going on for generations. Every year we delay brings more victims. The sound of vehicles outside interrupted their conversation. Sarah immediately moved to the window, peering through curtains she'd drawn for privacy. 3 trucks, she reported. Men getting out. They don't look like they're here for a social visit. Jed felt whiskey press against his legs as the old dog sensed the tension in the room. Through the years, the hound had developed an almost supernatural ability to read dangerous situations, and his current behavior suggested immediate threats. "Back door?" Jed asked, already moving toward his pack. "Through the kitchen, but they'll have it covered if they're smart," Sarah replied, pulling a shotgun from a closet with the practiced movements of someone who'd prepared for this possibility. "There's a root cellar with an outside entrance, but we'd have to get to the backyard first." The sound of heavy boots on the front porch eliminated most of their options. Clayton had clearly decided that subtlety was no longer necessary. His family's survival depended on eliminating the evidence and the people who could testify to its significance. "Ms. McKenna," Clayton's voice called through the front door, artificially polite but carrying unmistakable menace. "We need to discuss the situation that's developed. I think you'll find our new proposal much more reasonable than our earlier conversation." Sarah looked at Jed with determination that reminded him of his late wife in her strongest moments. "The evidence is already distributed," she called back. "Killing us won't change anything. It'll just add murder charges to your family's list of crimes." "That's where you're wrong," Clayton replied. "See, we've done some research of our own tonight. Dr. James Morrison at the State University. He had an unfortunate accident on his way home from his office. Seems his car went off a mountain road. Professor Elizabeth Hawthorne at Portland State. House fire, very tragic. Amazing how quickly these academic types can disappear when they become inconvenient." The casual announcement of multiple murders hit both Jed and Sarah like physical blows. Clayton wasn't just threatening them. He was systematically eliminating everyone who'd received copies of the evidence. The scope of violence he was willing to employ exceeded anything Jed had imagined. "You're insane," Sarah called back, though. Her voice carried less certainty than before. "I'm practical," Clayton replied. "My family didn't survive and prosper for over a century by being squeamish about necessary actions. Sometimes problems require permanent solutions, especially when those problems threaten everything we've built." Through the kitchen window, Jed could see men positioning themselves around the house. They moved with military precision, suggesting either professional training or extensive experience with this kind of operation. Whatever happened next, it wouldn't be a casual confrontation. It would be a siege designed to eliminate witnesses permanently. "Sarah," Jed whispered, "is there a way to contact outside help without them knowing?" She shook her head grimly. "They're probably jamming cell signals, and the landline runs right past where they're positioned. We're on our own until someone realizes we're missing." The reality of their situation settled over them like a weight. Clayton had clearly learned from his ancestors' methods, updating them for modern circumstances, but retaining the same willingness to use lethal force to protect family interests. The difference was that unlike the isolated families of the 1860s, Sarah and Jed had managed to distribute evidence before the trap closed. "You know what this means," Jed said quietly, studying Deputy Marshal Fletcher's badge. "Even if we don't survive this, the story will still come out. Fletcher died trying to expose these crimes, but his sacrifice is finally going to matter." Sarah nodded, checking her shotgun's ammunition with practiced efficiency. "The question is how many more people we can save by making sure our testimony survives along with the evidence." Outside, Clayton's voice continued its false reasonableness. "I'm going to count to 10. Then my associates are going to assume you're not interested in negotiating. I should mention that we've brought equipment that will make this house very uncomfortable very quickly. Fire has a way of encouraging people to reconsider their positions." The threat of fire galvanized both of them into action. Sarah grabbed a small recorder from her kitchen drawer and activated it, then began speaking rapidly into the device. "This is Sarah McKenna, County Historical Society, recording at approximately 8:30 p.m. on..." She provided date, location, and a summary of their situation, speaking with the clear diction of someone creating legal testimony. Jed, meanwhile, was studying the house's layout with the tactical awareness that had served him during his Korean War service decades earlier. The root cellar Sarah had mentioned offered potential cover, but limited escape options. The basement itself might provide better defensive positions, especially if they could reach it before Clayton's men breached. The main floor. "Sarah, how well do you know your neighbors? The Hendersons live about quarter-mile west, the Rodriguezes about the same distance east. Both families have been here for years, and they're not the type to ignore sounds of trouble." "That's what I was hoping," Jed said, his mind working through possibilities that combined his military experience with decades of mountain survival skills. "Clayton's making a mistake by bringing this many men to a rural area. Too much activity, too much noise. People will notice." As if responding to his observation, the distant sound of vehicle engines suggested additional arrivals. But instead of more of Clayton's people, these engines had the deeper rumble of farm trucks rather than the smooth purr of expensive SUVs. Through the side window, Sarah caught a glimpse of headlights approaching from multiple directions. "That's Jim Henderson's truck," she said with growing hope. "And Roberto Rodriguez's pickup. I think the cavalry is arriving." Clayton's voice from the front porch had lost some of its confidence. "Ms. McKenna, I strongly suggest you discourage any interference from local residents. This is a private matter that doesn't concern them." But Sarah was already moving toward the front door with her recorder still running. "Mr. Morco," she called out loudly enough for the arriving neighbors to hear, "you and your men are trespassing on private property while making threats of violence. I suggest you leave immediately before this situation escalates beyond your ability to control it." The tactical situation was shifting in ways that Clayton clearly hadn't anticipated. His plan had relied on isolating and eliminating witnesses quietly, but the arrival of additional local residents meant that any violence would occur in front of multiple witnesses who couldn't be easily silenced. As truck doors slammed and voices called out in the darkness, Jed felt a familiar sensation from his combat days, the moment when a desperate situation begins to turn in your favor through combination of preparation, luck, and the unexpected actions of decent people who refuse to stand aside when their neighbors are threatened. Deputy Marshal Fletcher's badge seemed to warm in his hand, as if the lawman's spirit approved of the way his long-delayed investigation was finally reaching its conclusion. Justice had been over a century in coming, but it was still justice, and sometimes that had to be enough. The arrival of Jim Henderson and Roberto Rodriguez, followed quickly by 3 other local families, transformed the situation from a private siege into a public confrontation. As pickup trucks formed a rough semicircle in Sarah's yard, their headlights created a harsh theater where decades of hidden crimes were about to be exposed under the glare of community attention. Jed stepped onto the front porch, Emma's small cloth doll visible in his weathered hands, its faded fabric catching the light in a way that made it seem almost luminous. The sight of the child's toy, carefully preserved for over a century, created a moment of profound silence, as everyone present seemed to grasp the significance of what they were witnessing. "Clayton," Jed said, his voice carrying clearly across. "The yard, this belonged to Emma Brennan. She was 7 years old when your great-great-grandfather murdered her along with her parents in 1867. She died because her family found gold on their legitimate claim, and your ancestor wanted it for himself." Clayton's face twisted with rage, but before he could respond, Jim Henderson stepped forward from behind his truck. "I know that name," the older farmer said. "My grandfather used to tell stories about the Brennan family. Said they disappeared one autumn, and their claim got taken over by folks who hadn't earned it." "Your grandfather was right," Sarah called from the doorway, holding up the original deed certificate so it was visible in the harsh light. "Thomas Brennan filed this claim legally in March 1867. 6 months later, his family was dead, and Silas Morco had somehow acquired ownership through suspicious documents that the territorial officials accepted without proper investigation." Roberto Rodriguez moved closer, his work-hardened face showing the kind of anger that came from recognizing injustice. "My family's been here 3 generations, he said. "We know the stories about families who disappeared, about claims that got stolen through violence. We just never had proof before." One of Clayton's men, clearly uncomfortable with the growing crowd of witnesses, moved his hand toward his jacket. But Martha Henderson emerged from behind her husband's truck with a shotgun cradled casually in her arms, and 2 other neighbors followed her example. The tactical balance that Clayton had counted on was shifting rapidly against him. "You people don't understand what you're interfering with," Clayton said, his earlier composure cracking under the pressure of multiple witnesses and shifting odds. "My family has provided employment and stability to this region for generations. You're going to destroy the economic foundation of your own communities for the sake of people who've been dead for over a century." "No," Jed replied firmly, holding Emma's doll higher so everyone could see it clearly. "We're going to honor the memory of people who were murdered for their property. This little girl died because your family values gold more than human life, and that fundamental truth hasn't changed in 5 generations." Sarah stepped forward with her digital recorder, ensuring that every word of the confrontation was being captured for posterity. "Clayton, you've already confessed to multiple murders tonight. Dr. Morrison, Professor Hawthorne, you admitted to killing them just as your ancestor killed the Brennans. The pattern of violence is identical across the generations." "Those were necessary actions," Clayton snarled, abandoning any pretense of civility. "Sometimes problems require permanent solutions, especially when academic idealists threaten practical realities. My family protects what we've built, just like any successful enterprise." The casual admission of murder sent a visible shock through the assembled neighbors. These were people who might disagree about politics or land use, but who shared fundamental values about right and wrong. Hearing Clayton dismiss human lives as problems requiring permanent solutions crystallized their understanding of what they were confronting. Whiskey, who had been staying close to Jed's side throughout the confrontation, suddenly began growling with an intensity that made everyone turn their attention toward the forest beyond the yard lights. The old dog's instincts, honed by years of mountain life, were detecting something that human senses had missed. "More vehicles approaching from the north," Martha Henderson reported, her experienced ears picking up engine sounds that others couldn't. Yet here, sounds like several trucks moving fast. Clayton's expression showed a mixture of relief and concern. Either reinforcements were arriving to help him regain control, or outside authorities were responding to reports of the confrontation. Given his earlier boasts about controlling local law enforcement, the identity of the approaching vehicles would determine whether the situation escalated toward greater violence or moved toward legitimate resolution. "Whatever happens next," Jed said, raising his voice so everyone present could hear clearly, "I want all of you to remember that this started with a 7-year-old girl who loved her doll and trusted adults to protect her. Emma Brennan died because people with power chose violence over justice, and that choice has been repeated by every generation of the Morco family since 1867. He held the small doll against his chest, feeling the weight of responsibility that had driven him from the moment he'd first discovered the hidden compartment in the rotted wagon. Tonight, that pattern ends. Tonight, Emma Brennan finally gets the justice her family was denied. The sound of approaching vehicles grew louder, and everyone in the yard prepared for whatever was coming next, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether a century of hidden crimes would finally face the light of justice or disappear forever under another layer of violence and intimidation. The approaching vehicles proved to be state police cruisers and federal agents. Their arrival coordinated through Sarah's earlier calls to authorities who operated outside the Morco family's sphere of influence. As uniformed officers emerged from their vehicles with weapons drawn, the balance of power shifted decisively away from Clayton and his hired men. "Nobody move," commanded Agent Rebecca Torres of the FBI's regional office, her voice carrying the authority of federal law enforcement. "We have warrants for the arrest of Clayton Morco and associates on charges of conspiracy, murder, and racketeering under federal statutes governing historical crimes and ongoing criminal enterprises." Clayton's face went pale as he realized that his family's century of influence had finally reached its limits. Federal jurisdiction meant that local connections and regional political power were irrelevant. The crimes he'd boasted about just minutes earlier were being treated as elements of a continuing criminal conspiracy that federal courts would take very seriously. One of his hired men made the mistake of reaching for his weapon, but Whiskey launched himself from Jed's side with a speed that belied his advanced age. The old dog's protective instincts, honed by years of guarding his master in dangerous country, drove him to attack the threat with fierce determination. His powerful jaws clamped down on the gunman's wrist, preventing the draw while giving the federal agents time to secure the situation. "Good boy, Whiskey," Jed said proudly as agents moved to restrain Clayton's men. The old dog had probably saved lives through his quick action, proving that loyalty and courage weren't diminished by age when they served a righteous cause. As handcuffs clicked and Miranda rights were read, Sarah approached Agent Torres with the digital recorder and copies of all the evidence they'd assembled. "Agent Torres, everything is documented here. The historical crimes, tonight's threats, Clayton's admission of murdering Dr. Morrison and Professor Hawthorne. Plus, we have multiple civilian witnesses to corroborate the threats and confessions." Agent Torres examined the evidence with professional efficiency, her expression growing more grim as she understood the scope of what they were confronting. "Ms. McKenna, based on your initial call and the preliminary investigation we conducted this afternoon, we've already secured additional evidence that supports federal prosecution. The Morco family's business records show a pattern of fraud, intimidation, and violence that extends well beyond the historical crimes." Clayton, now restrained between two federal agents, made one final attempt to assert his family's influence. "You have no idea what you're doing," he snarled at the assembled crowd. "My lawyers will have this entire case dismissed within a week. My family has connections that go all the way to Washington." "Your family had connections," Agent Torres corrected calmly. Past tense. "The investigation that began with Ms. McKenna's call this afternoon has already resulted in the arrest of 3 state officials, 2 federal judges, and a dozen business associates who were part of your family's network of corruption. Your connections are now evidence in our case." The systematic dismantling of the Moorcock power structure had apparently been planned for months, with Sarah's evidence providing the final catalyst that federal authorities needed to move. The scope of the operation suggested that Jed's discovery of the wagon had triggered consequences far beyond anything he could have imagined. As Clayton and his men were loaded into federal vehicles, Jim Henderson approached Jed with obvious respect. "That was a brave thing you did, taking on a family that powerful with nothing but the truth as your weapon." "Wasn't just me," Jed replied, carefully wrapping Emma's doll for protection during transport back to the mountains. "This little girl waited over a century for someone to listen to her story. I just happened to be the one who found her family's journal." Roberto Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. "My grandfather always said that the mountains remember everything, even when people try to forget. Maybe they were just waiting for the right person to come along and help them tell their stories." As the federal vehicles departed with their prisoners, Agent Torres provided final instructions to Sarah and Jed. "You'll both need to provide formal testimony over the next several weeks, but the immediate danger is over. The Moorcock organization is finished. We've frozen their assets, arrested their key associates, and exposed their methods to public scrutiny. There won't be any retaliation because there's no organization left to retaliate." The crowd of neighbors began to disperse, returning to their homes with the satisfied sense of having witnessed justice finally served. Martha Henderson lingered to ensure that Jed had transportation back to his mountain camp, while Sarah made arrangements to accompany him for the formal burial ceremony that would finally give the Brennan family the dignity they'd been denied. As Jed settled into the passenger seat of Martha's truck, Whiskey curled up beside him with the contented exhaustion of a dog who'd done his duty well. The old hound's courage in attacking the armed man had probably prevented bloodshed, and certainly demonstrated that age didn't diminish the fierce loyalty that defined the best qualities of both dogs and men. Looking back at Sarah's house, now, quiet in the aftermath of the confrontation, Jed felt a profound sense of completion. Emma Brennan's doll rested safely in his pack, soon to be reunited with the child who'd treasured it during her brief life. Justice had been delayed by over a century, but it had finally arrived with the full weight of federal law behind it. The mountains that had hidden the Brennan family's tragedy for so long would soon witness their vindication as truth finally proved stronger than the lies that had buried it. 3 weeks later, under an autumn sky that painted the Oregon mountains, in shades of gold and amber, a small gathering assembled at the site where the Brennan family had lived and died. The memorial stone that would serve as their permanent monument had been carved from local granite, its surface polished smooth to reflect the morning light that filtered through the towering Douglas firs. Jed stood beside the stone with Whiskey. At his side, both of them transformed by the events that had begun with a rotted wagon and a desperate gamble with a silver dollar. The old mountain man had gained weight in recent weeks, his hollow cheeks filled out by regular meals and his eyes bright with renewed purpose. The community that had rallied to support him during the confrontation had embraced him as a hero, though Jed insisted he'd merely done what anyone would have done when faced with such clear evidence of injustice. Sarah McKenna approached the key memorial with a small wooden box in her hands, its contents representing the final chapter in a story that had waited over a century to reach its conclusion. Inside the box, wrapped in new white cloth, lay Emma Brennan's doll alongside a few wildflowers that had been picked from the creek where the child had played during the last happy months of her life. Thomas Brennan, Mary Brennan, and Emma Brennan, Sarah read from the stone's inscription. Lost to violence in 1867, remembered with love in 2025. May their story serve as a reminder that justice delayed is not justice denied, and that truth has a power that outlasts those who would bury it. Father Miguel offered a prayer for the family's souls, his words carrying across the peaceful valley where shining Water Creek still ran clear and bright. The young priest had become deeply involved in the memorial process, seeing it as an opportunity for the community to confront its history honestly and find healing through acknowledgement of past wrongs. Among the gathered witnesses were representatives from 3 universities, whose researchers were already using the Brennan case as a foundation for broader investigations into territorial-era crimes. The systematic nature of the murders had opened new avenues for historical research that would likely reveal additional victims and bring closure to other families who'd lost ancestors under mysterious circumstances. Agent Torres attended on behalf of the federal investigation, which had expanded far beyond the Morco family to encompass a network of corruption that had influenced regional development for generations. Her preliminary report suggested that dozens of legitimate claims had been stolen through violence, with the profits used to establish the political and economic power structures that had dominated the area well into the modern era. The Brennan family's courage in documenting their experience has made it possible to identify at least 30 other families who suffered similar fates, Agent Torres told the assembled group. Their journal and the evidence Mr. Cole preserved will serve as the foundation for historical justice that extends far beyond this single case. As the formal ceremony concluded, Jed carefully placed Emma's doll in the small grave that had been prepared beside the memorial stone. The tiny figure looked peaceful against the white cloth, finally reunited with the child who had carried it across a continent in search of dreams that were cut short by greed and violence. She deserves to rest with her family, Jed said quietly, his weathered hands gentle as he arranged the burial. They've been separated long enough. Martha Henderson, who had become something of an unofficial coordinator for the ongoing historical research, announced that the Brennan claim site would be preserved as a historical monument. The gold that Thomas had found still lay buried somewhere in the creek bed, but everyone agreed that it should remain undisturbed as part of the memorial to the family's sacrifice. Some treasures are worth more when they're left alone, Martha observed. Emma called this place Shining Water, and maybe that's the real gold here. The beauty that drew her family west and the memory of their hopes for a better life. As the crowd began to disperse, several people approached Jed with offers of permanent housing, steady work, and the kind of community support that could transform his remaining years from survival into genuine prosperity. The man who had spent his last dollar on a rotted wagon now found himself with options he hadn't imagined possible just a month earlier. But it was Tom Miller's offer that resonated most strongly with Jed's heart. The sawmill owner wanted to hire him not just as a worker, but as a historian and guide who could help preserve the stories of other families who had shaped the region's development through courage, sacrifice, and determination. There are more stories out there, Tom said. More families whose names have been forgotten and whose contributions haven't been properly acknowledged. Someone with your instincts for reading the land and understanding people could make sure their sacrifices aren't lost to time. Sarah had already begun organizing the Historical Society's expanded mission, which would include systematic investigation of suspicious disappearances and land transfers from the territorial period. The work would require someone with both outdoor skills and emotional intelligence, qualities that Jed had demonstrated throughout his quest for justice for the Brennan family. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the memorial site, Jed found himself alone with Whiskey beside the newly placed stone. The old dog had recovered completely from his heroic actions during the confrontation, though he moved with an air of dignified satisfaction that suggested he understood the significance of what they'd accomplished together. "What do you think, old friend?" Jed asked, scratching behind the dog's ears. "Ready for another adventure?" Whiskey's tail wagged slowly, and his bright eyes suggested that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together with the same loyalty and determination that had carried them through the greatest adventure of their lives. The memorial stone caught the late afternoon light, its polished surface reflecting not just the surrounding forest, but the hope that justice, however delayed, could still prevail when good people refused to accept that might makes right. In the peaceful valley, where a family had once dreamed of building their future, their memory would now inspire others to ensure that such dreams were protected rather than destroyed by those who valued gold more than human life. Sometimes Jed reflected as he and Whiskey began the walk back to their new home in town, the most important treasures were the ones that couldn't be stolen, sold, or buried. Love, loyalty, truth, and justice. These were the real gold that made life worth living, and they were the legacy that would outlast any fortune built on violence and lies.